Well, this year, both the Oregon and the Washington legislatures cut significant amounts of funding for the Columbia River Gorge Commission. This change could put the gorge in danger. To discuss the potential impact of these cuts, we have Laurie Aunan and Steve McCarthy with us today. Laurie is the executive director of Friends of the Columbia Gorge. She has a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley and a bachelor's degree from Florida State University. She practiced real estate law in Southern California for 6 years and came to Oregon, where she worked with the Oregon State Public Institute and Research Group, Public Interest Research Group for 4 years promoting recycling. Laurie lives and enthusiastically grows vegetables in the Columbia River Gorge. If she can tell me how to keep deer from eating my beans, my spinach, and my beets, she'll go to heaven from my point of view. Steve McCarthy, who will be our first speaker today, is the governor's appointee to the Columbia River Gorge Commission. He is also a member of the National Board of Directors of the Sierra Club's Legal Defense Fund and has in the past chaired the board of 1,000 Friends of Oregon. Steve grew up in Roseburn, Oregon, and graduated from Reed. He now sits on Reed's Board of Trustees. He also went on to get a law degree from NYU and actually worked for a while in Mayor John Lindsay's office in New York City. Back in Oregon, he had a brief law practice, directed Osberg, was on the board and then general manager of TriMet, and then owned and operated a sporting goods company for 10 years, which he sold in 1987. Clearly not afraid of changing his life's direction from time to time, Steve brought all of this education and experience to bear on the making of terrific brandies when he started Clear Creek Distillery in 1987. I would love to hear both Laurie and Steve describe to someone, some young person who wants to do when they grow up what they're doing now, the precise nature of the educational route that one must take to get there. In addition to his position on the Columbia River Gorge Commission, Steve has ranching and timber interests in Hood River, and today he and Laurie will discuss the future of the Columbia River Gorge with us from their own vantage points. Please welcome first Steve and then Laurie.
Thanks, Fran. Let me introduce one of my fellow commissioners who I see drove all the way down from the Dalles. Janice Staver is here in this table. Janice is a musician and an artist in the Dalles and is one of the other two. There are 3 appointees by the governor of Oregon. The third is Louis Pitt, who many of you know from the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs. First, let me give you your reading assignments. 3 excellent publications can bring you up to speed on the geology of the Columbia River Gorge, the political history of the Scenic Act, and the events since the passage of the Act. Cataclysm on the Columbia by John Allen and Marjorie Burns, published by Timber Press, describes the Brett's floods, the giant floods between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago, unleashed by the melting of glaciers in Montana that allowed enormous Ice Age lakes to break loose and scour the Grand Coulee and burst through the Cascade Range and create what we know as the gorge. Many signs of these floods are still visible, including high water marks on the dry hills at the eastern end of the gorge and in the sculpting of the Tom McCall Preserve at Rowena. Cubic miles of water moved across the land 1,000 feet deep and going 50 miles an hour. Equally cataclysmic, but more recent, were the politics of the creation of the National Scenic Area Act. Bowen Blair wrote a good article in volume 17 of the Environmental Law Review describing the politics of the act. Finally, a new book, Planning a New West, the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area by Abbott, Adler, and Adler, and just published by the OSU Press, is a thorough discussion of the events leading up to the passage of the act, and more important, of the development of the Gorge Management Plan by the Commission and the Forest Service. Secondly, let me give you a few facts. The scenic area, created in 1986, encompasses 290,000 acres on both sides of the Columbia River from the Deschutes to the Sandy River. It extends from 2 to 4 miles back from the Columbia. The purposes of the act are the following, and I'll read you a couple of these wonderful congressional prose passages. To establish a national scenic area to protect and provide for the enhancement of the scenic, cultural, recreational, and natural resources of the Columbia River Gorge, and to support and to protect and support the economy of the Columbia River Gorge by encouraging growth to occur in existing urban areas and by allowing future economic development to occur in a manner that is consistent with paragraph 1. The act established the commission and gave it the authority to plan those portions of the 6 counties, 3 in Oregon and 3 in Washington, that fall within the scenic area. The commission can and has overturned county land use decisions. This is a powerful tool. It may not sound like much, but try it sometime. The act also exempted urban areas totaling 28,000 acres from regulation under the act. This exemption represents a threefold political deal. Development can occur in a very large portion of the gorge, 28,000 acres, about half the size of the city of Seattle in terms of acreage. $20 million was authorized in the act for economic development, primarily in those urban areas. And finally, the residents of those urban areas in the gorge would be the economic beneficiaries of enormous public investment in preserving and enhancing an especially beautiful part of the world. Now, the commission consists of 12 citizens, volunteers, not paid, 6 from each state, 3 appointed by each governor, and 1 by the county commission of each county. We're funded by the Oregon and Washington general fund appropriations, and until this year at about $500,000 per state per biennium. That's about 6 cents per citizen per year in the state of Oregon. The substantive funding for the National Scenic Act is authorized in the federal act and totals $74.8 million. Here's what I have found and what I'd like to report to you after 3 years and 3 months as one of our governor's 3 appointees. There have been some wonderful, spectacular accomplishments as a result of the act. Skamania Lodge, built with $5 million of National Scenic Act money and Skamania County and private funds. Now the largest private employer in Skamania County with 18% of the total private jobs in the county. The Dalles Discovery Center, an extraordinarily beautiful museum-like building just west of the Dalles on the riverside of I-84, an example of extraordinary community generosity and $5 million of National Scenic Act funds. Much beautiful, fragile countryside has been preserved. My favorite project is the Columbia Gorge Highway restoration, especially the Hood River to Mosier segment. This spectacular 6-mile hike, bike, wheelchair pathway, including a restoration of the twin tunnels, will be opened in the next year or so. This project, I predict, will become one of the main attractions of the gorge. The gorge is much more beautiful than I realized. I've been hiking there since the early 50s, and I thought I knew it well. But it is a lot more than the deep canyons and dark forests of Eagle Creek or Aunan. The most beautiful part, I think, is the fragile transition area where the Cascades change into the brown hills of eastern Oregon. At Catherine Creek or Tom McCall Preserve or in the hills above Memaloose Island, you'll find a strange and exotic mix of dry land and wet forest plants and animals, and some that live only at the fringes of the two worlds. But don't all go at once. Land acquisition, recreation planning, and trail construction in these areas, as in much of the gorge, has not kept up with demand. The biggest surprise of all to me is the richness of the Indian heritage in the gorge. This was a major center of Indian culture for thousands of years. We, us white men, hardly know what treasures are out there. Those of you who have been to a certain place set about with hollows in the basalt that may have been Vision Quest pits know what I mean. This place exists, but I'm not going to tell you where it is. I hope we can find the money someday to make some of this richness available to the public without setting it up for destruction. The legality of the act has been upheld. After its passage, I think we were right up there with the Trilateral Commission secular humanism, and the black helicopters. There have been 63 lawsuits dealing with all possible constitutional issues. In every single one of these, we have prevailed. There have been no takings of private property. Some of the zoning is burdensome, but it is not confiscatory. It is worth noting here that most of what the Commission does amounts to zoning. The Gorge Plan is a zoning map. The premise of this zoning and of the Act is that if we plan carefully and if we have the courage to stick to the plan, we can have economic development and a high level of protection. Otherwise, we'll have a land rush. Some people will make a quick buck and move on, and we'll have neither real long-term economic prosperity nor a protected treasure that we can use and enjoy for the next 50 or 100 years. When I arrived at my first Gorge Commission meeting 3 years ago, prepared to fearlessly commission the Gorge, I expected to find a little agency dedicated to carrying out its responsibility under the Act, engaged in economic development, recreation planning, cultural and natural resource protection, building support in the community for its programs, defining and profiting by its relationship to the Forest Service, scrutinizing and improving its plan, finding the money to do all this, and making the case day by day in everything it said and did for gorge protection. I didn't expect it to be perfect, but I thought I'd find a clear commitment to protection and some kind of a simple strategy, a focus that tied these efforts together and pointed to the future. What I found was very different. I've taken my time in arriving at the conclusions I'm going to report to you today, partly so I could get along with my fellow commissioners as long as possible. I had hoped to change the way the Commission and the staff were going about their business, and in fact, I think I made a little progress. But recent legislative action has convinced me that our course has been flawed. I'm not serving any purpose in pretending that the ability of the Commission and the staff to protect your gorge has not been severely damaged. We had a good federal law, a good management plan, a 10-year head start, and $74 million to spend. We had a shootout in the last legislative session. We lost. We need to re-examine what we've been doing. What did I find when I showed up for work, as I call it, when I showed up to be not paid 3 years ago? The Commission and the staff strategy seemed to be to try to get along with everyone, to be fair, to try to be liked. There has been a timid, almost apologetic quality about our attitude towards protecting the gorge. We often begin presentations by pointing out that nearly 100% of all building applications in the gorge are approved by the Commission. Fairness in the minds of some commissioners seems to mean neutrality. The federal law establishing the gorge scenic area is a congressional judgment about protection and development in the gorge. The act is not neutral. Congress said that the gorge should be planned as a unit, not as 6 counties, each one making its own local political trade-offs. The notion that the counties can do it better was explicitly rejected by Congress. That's why the zoning of the Commission overrides local zoning. Congress also said that development should take place almost entirely in the urban areas. Outside the urban areas, the intent of the act is to preserve the special qualities of the gorge. Not only is there no long-run strategy for gorge protection, the Commission has not had a consensus that there should even be a long run. Many of my colleagues feel that once all 6 counties have passed land use ordinances that conform to the management plan, the Commission's job is done. Our only remaining responsibility would be to hear land use appeals from county decisions. This may explain the curious reluctance of the Commission to raise money. Our requests for legislative funding have been virtually flat for 10 years. I have suggested repeatedly since I've been on the Commission that we try to raise money from new sources. The official reply was that new money would mean that our legislative appropriations would be reduced. So we have not found the money nor put in place the programs to carry out extremely important portions of the Act. For example, the identification and protection of the Indian heritage. This was a major part of the Act. Nothing has been done, almost nothing has been done. A grant to interview some old Indians with knowledge of the location of important sites has not been implemented because we were not able to reconcile differences among the tribes. Those differences could have been solved. It would take a commitment of staff time and money. Because of the action of the legislature, the amount of staff time and money available on the part of the Gorge Commission to try to reconcile those tribes, I think, is $2,000 in the next fiscal year. The Commission has no gorge-wide recreation planning effort. It has almost no recreation planning effort at all. Are there enough trails? Are they in the right places? Is there enough safe river access for fishing, for boating, for windsurfing? Why aren't planned trails being built? Why does trail funding disappear into the regional office of the Forest Service and never reappear? Even more important, how can the incredible economic potential represented by gorge recreation be captured by the people that live in the gorge? Probably our biggest failing was economic development. The Act included $20 million for economic development. $10 million was spent at Skamania Lodge and the Dallas Discovery Center. I think this has been very well spent. Skamania is a marvelous property. What's happened to the other $10 million? Early in its history, the Commission gave the responsibility for economic development to the two states. I still do not understand this deal, and I think it was a serious mistake. Even so, I expected to see the Commission involved in crafting a series of sustainable development projects that would help the people who live in the gorge figure out how to make money by saving the gorge. Ultimately, we need to harness the engines of capitalism in this effort. $10 million is a lot of money. We won't get this chance again. There are a lot of countries that would like $10 million for economic development. What I found was a nightmare. The state and regional economic development bureaucracies have been opposed to the Act. They have no interest in developing businesses that will support the purpose of the Act. Much of the money has gone to local governments, not to private businesses or individuals. These governments had planning staffs, and they got there first. Here are a few of the economic grants and loans. $100,000 to the Dalles for curbs and gutters. $21,000 for a golf course marketing and feasibility study by the Wasco County Commission. And here's the all-time winner. $100,000 to the city of Stevenson, Washington for a downtown one-way street couplet, more curbs and gutters, that involves filling in 12 acres of wetland. It was made clear to me in my first commission meeting that I was to ask questions, but not very good ones, about these programs, that we were supposed to rubber stamp them. The commission has taken a lot of heat for the failure of the economic development part of the program. You know the old political saying, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, we've been taking the heat and we can't get in the kitchen. We are required to analyze the plan and change it as appropriate. I had hoped that this analysis, called monitoring in the deadly language of planning, would tell us and everyone else what was working and what was not, would enable us to deal with the upcoming barrage of efforts to weaken the plan from a position of technical and professional strength, to make trades if necessary, but to know what we were getting and what we were giving away, to understand what parts of the management plan had to be preserved at all costs. Do we have a top-notch analysis of whether all that scenic zoning, forest zoning, and agriculture zoning is actually protecting scenery, forest, and ag land? We do not. With the help of Senator Hatfield's office, we've got a grant to partially offset the cost of finding out. The balance of the cost was to have been funded by the legislatures of Oregon and Washington as part of their ongoing support of the Commission. The money did not happen. We think we can salvage a limited part of this effort, but only at a terrible cost to almost all our other programs. So when the folks who have always been against gorge protection went after us in the last legislature, two things became clear to me. Our strategy of keeping our head down, of being fair, and trying to get everyone to like us, had not appeased our enemies. It never does. Our failure to carry out the Act has alienated us from our friends, and it has not built us any support among the great majority of people who would like to support us but haven't been involved and haven't even been asked. Recent legislative action in both the Oregon and Washington legislatures amounts to a de facto repeal of the National Scenic Area Act by the state legislatures. Our funding was cut from about $260,000 per state per year to $75,000 per year in Washington and $120,000 per year in Oregon. Here's what this means. The plan analysis will be cut to less than half its former scope. We may not be able to defend the plan because we may not be able to say whether it is working. To save even that amount of money, we had to gut our other programs. Virtually all involvement in economic development, recreation planning, cultural resource protection, review of county zoning decisions, review of forest management practices, participation in the planning efforts for the Sandy River Delta, Catherine Creek, Major Creek, and others will cease. The legislative level of funding over the long term will support one staff person and a clerical person. By scrambling, we can keep the store open for another year at nearly today's levels, but we don't even have money in our budget to raise money. There's a special irony to what the legislature did. The commission and its staff were the real instruments of local control over the federal presence in the scenic area. We had the ability to direct federal funds and federal land management agencies in a manner that more nearly reflected what the people of this region and of the gorge itself wanted. What now? I don't know. The funding meltdown just occurred. We didn't know the full impact until Tuesday. Some of the non-state level sources of funding are still uncertain. As a beginning, you deserve a frank assessment of the situation. The only cheerful note I can add is that there's an enormous amount of support for protecting the gorge. It just seems to me that the commission and the staff have done their best to avoid it. Thanks for your attention. This is the first time in the 3.5 years that I've served on this commission that I've been asked by anyone, media or otherwise, what's going on in the gorge. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Well, Steve, I have one question. Are you sure you can't tell us exactly how you really feel? I'm Laurie Aunan, Executive Director of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, and Steve just asked, what now? I will get to that. I will get to what now. But we just heard a lot of talk about what's happened to the Columbia River Gorge Commission, and that's an agency a lot of people don't know much about, haven't known much about, maybe didn't even know existed. But I'm going to tell you about what that means and why it's important. And I want to start out with a little story, personal story. 7 years ago, my husband and I moved to the community of Corbett. It's a rural center in the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area. We bought a small older house on the side of an old logging camp from the turn of the century. We have some old growth cedar trees left on our property, and we have some big old stumps that have the notches cut in where they put the springboards when they did the logging. So it's a very historic place and a wonderful community. I was thrilled to be in the gorge. I thought the fact that there's a national scenic area means that people care enough about future generations to plan for them and care enough about the land to protect it from urban sprawl that I've seen personally pave over so many special places. A few weeks later, I was chatting with a neighbor at the Corbett post office. He asked if I lived in the area. He hadn't seen me before, and I said, yes, I do. He said, did you buy a house? I said, yes, we did. And he said, well, you're lucky. You're lucky you bought a house here. You know, this area, the gorge, is going to be the Lake Oswego of Gresham. Well, I don't mean any disrespect for either place, but that scared me. And if I ever had any questions, I knew then I could never take for granted the rural character, the open spaces, the farms, and the forests. Because unfortunately, some people, including my neighbor apparently dreaming of turning the gorge into Gresham or Lake Oswego, think about the gorge as a place to maximize profit for the short term through maximum development. And in the future, there may be plenty of chances to do just that. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of listening to Bill Dietrich, a reporter for the Seattle Times who covers these types of issues, and he was talking about the challenges facing the Northwest, and he just tossed out some more statistics. You always hear statistics about growth these days, but here's some that puts it in another light. During the Great Western Migration, 30 years from 1840 to 1870, 350,000 people moved to the American West. Today, 350,000 people move to Oregon and Washington every 2 years. Since 1990 alone, 1 million people have moved to Oregon and Washington. Well, now, Bill Dietrich isn't the only person who's recognized that it's getting a lot more crowded lately. We've seen recently the Oregonian articles about development on the coast, including a sentence saying, exceptions to land use law are becoming common on the coast as pressure to develop intensifies. We see Clark County exploding with growth with a 33% growth rate from 1990 to 1997. Things in the news all the time, the recent controversy over the resort at Smith Rock State Park, the deterioration of Oregon state parks, the stress on schools and roads. Of course, we know all this is related to the growth boom that doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. Okay, you may say, yes, we know there's growth, but I don't see it happening in the gorge. I drive down the gorge, it looks fine. And maybe it's not so bad to cut back on a bureaucratic agency that doesn't sound like it's doing its job anyway. Isn't the gorge still protected? Well, on your tables, and if it's still there, there's a copy of an aerial photo. Shows the city of Troutdale on the left. In the middle, running down the middle, is the Sandy River, which is the boundary of the National Scenic Area. And on the right is the rural farms and forest lands of the National Scenic Area, part of where I live in Corbett. You can see what a thin line separates the rural lands of the gorge from the urban sprawl. But the thin line, as we've just heard, is not just the physical boundary of the river. Columbia Gorge protection is hanging by a thread, an increasingly thin line of political will that is in danger of breaking. The line is bending, and from what Steve said, it sounds like it's broken under the attack on the Gorge Commission's budget. And that attack was intended to strike at the heart of gorge protection while appearing not to. I want to read from a statement by Washington Representative Mark Bolt, quoted in the Skamania Pioneer after he led the campaign to slash the Commission's budget. Quote, "We thought the best thing was the budget, but we had to find a year when the makeup of the Washington state legislature was right." And then he says, quote, "The real battle is yet to come." Well, he has that last part right. The real battle is yet to come. The future of the gorge for the next 100 years and longer will be decided by policy decisions in the next 2 years. Decisions that will be made in the next 2 years. And these decisions will largely be made by the Gorge Commission that you just heard Steve describe to you. Well, what future will the gorge have? There are two, I think. In one possible future, the most spectacular scenic vistas and natural areas are protected from development and logging. When people stand on the cliffs at Crown Point, or Cape Horn, or the Tom McCall Preserve, they see landscapes that have endured for more than 100 years, which these days is something of an accomplishment. People from all walks of life experience the beauty, history, and nature of the gorge from east to west in both states at safe, well-maintained parks and public lands. They have access to the Columbia River, its beaches and waterfalls, to old-growth forests, to wildflower meadows, and clear, clean streams that support native fish. Productive orchards, farms, and ranches are thriving, providing jobs and fresh local food. Timber harvest does continue on less sensitive land at sustainable levels that provide jobs and ensure forests will be there for future generations. Gorge cities are healthy and vibrant, centers of the community, providing family wage jobs and affordable housing. They're not sprawling over the rural countryside. Native plants and animals are thriving. There are still 15 kinds of wildflowers found nowhere else in the world. There is still wildlife that exists nowhere but in the gorge. And when you enter the gorge, you can feel and see that you are in a place like nowhere else in the world. You know that you are in the Columbia River Gorge. This is the future that the Gorge Act set out to achieve. The Gorge Act was intended to ensure economic opportunity without sacrificing a special place. And whether this future is achieved today rests largely in the hands of the Gorge Commission. But you've just heard a commission described by Steve McCarthy with no sense of why it exists collectively, no funding, no programs, no information, little leadership, and few prospects, it sounds like. So will we reach that future that the Gorge Act envisioned? Or will we have another future, and here's just a few horribles to throw out. Hiking trails are closed down and parks are shut down for lack of funding. What trails are left are overcrowded, dangerous, and degraded. Forested hillsides are slashed to the ground. They are never replanted. Instead of growing trees, the hills grow gigantic view homes visible for miles. Wildflower meadows are converted to golf courses and suburban lawns. Gated subdivisions cover once productive farmland and orchard land. Every freeway exit sports a fast food franchise, gas station, or outlet mall. And when you enter the Columbia Gorge, you don't even notice. Clearly, this future may be hard to imagine today. Today, thanks to the Gorge Act, there are no proposals for strip malls, condominiums, or Disneyland-style resorts in the rural lands of the gorge. But this protection has been taken for granted. As a result, the gorge is being slowly degraded, and the real development pressure is just beginning. In noting threats to the Oregon coast, the Oregonian reported almost half the coastline is privately owned and open for development. In the National Scenic Area, more than half, about 70% of the land is private and open for development. So in the long term, the only thing standing between the gorge and urban sprawl is a strong Gorge Act, and that's two components. First, it's the regional planning and protection the Gorge Commission is supposed to provide. Secondly, it is the funding for public lands, recreation, and economic development that comes from the federal government through the Forest Service. It's very important to understand that the Gorge Act is a broad and flexible framework that is implemented through rules adopted by the Gorge Commission. The protection of more than half of the land in the gorge stands or falls depending on what the Gorge Commission does. And again, we've just heard Steve tell us the Gorge Commission is not doing the job it needs to do, and now the budget cuts make sure that it cannot do that job. I don't believe this is an accident. Gutting the budget weakens gorge protection by intent. In a 1995 memo, the prosecuting attorney for Skamania County, which has historically been an opponent of the act, flew its flag at half-mast when the act passed, writes of a meeting with several Washington state representatives, quote, "We did discuss the possibility of the state of Washington rescinding the National Scenic Area Act compact. We should draft a letter to the representatives proposing the repeal of the state of Washington's agreement to the Gorge Act." Well, there it is in black and white. And we see this pressure to undo the act at the same time that intense development pressure is battering at the gorge. And to make it worse, in this time of internal weakness and external pressure, the Commission has on its work plan the planning to revise its land use laws that should protect farmland, forest land, open spaces, natural and cultural resources. If that work plan stands by next year, at this time, I expect to see proposals for the Commission to rezone farm and forest land to residential use, eliminate protection guidelines for natural and cultural resources, allow more land to be subdivided, and allow more commercial development outside urban areas. Meanwhile, what's been happening under current laws? Just a few things. Under current gorge land use laws, prime farmland is already being converted to residential development, particularly in the West End closest to Portland and Vancouver. The Gorge Act did intend existing urban areas, the 13 cities and towns in the gorge, more than 28,000 acres, as Steve said, to be the focus for growth. Yet rural lands in the gorge are being developed at a faster pace than the cities. Urban subdivisions outside urban areas are still being proposed and in one case approved by a county planning department. Only a successful appeal by Friends of the Columbia Gorge halted construction on a proposed illegal urban subdivision marketed as the Little Gold Mine. More than 1,200 new developments have been approved in the National Scenic Area since 1988. The Gorge Commission does boast that 98% of all development proposals are approved. In 1983, when the Gorge Act was being debated, Lake Tahoe's 95% development approval rate was held up as a failure that should not be repeated in the gorge. Worst of all, the Gorge Commission has done nothing to determine what these trends mean for the future of the gorge. The Commission is not planning to assess the cumulative impact of thousands of new developments. They're not planning to determine if full build-out of development allowed under current zoning will damage the gorge's rural character, landscape, and resources. What is the Commission doing? Well, one thing that's got a high priority on the work plan is recommended expansion of some urban growth boundaries. This is really not talked about in this way. It's called a mapping error study. However, as it stands now, by the end of the year, the Commission may well be asking Congress to open up the Gorge Act and amend the Gorge Act to expand urban development in the gorge. The Commission won't know if this land is really needed for urban growth because they're not planning to do the analysis to find out. They won't know if this urban expansion will convert farm and forest land because they're not going to ask those questions. And of course, once a bill is introduced in Congress, it can become a Christmas tree for everyone who ever wanted to subdivide the gorge. Okay, not all is doom and gloom, and after that, I'm ready for some good news, and I hope you are. And there is some good news, very good news, and reason for hope. In June, I traveled to Washington, D.C. together with some gorge landowners who have offered to sell their land to the public to protect important resources. These landowners see a financial benefit from selling their property, and Friends sees a benefit to the gorge from the permanent protection of public ownership. 1 week ago, Senator Slade Gorton included $8 million in the Senate's annual spending bill to purchase important scenic and natural lands in the gorge. This is incredibly significant for the landowners and for the gorge. This is the largest single amount ever proposed in 1 year to purchase gorge lands, and this is a big deal. It's huge, and we were very concerned after Senator Hatfield retired, but we've now seen someone step forward and take on that leadership. So I applaud Senator Gorton for his leadership. In addition to the land purchase funding, he's included funding for gorge recreation and is supporting a land exchange under which forest land will be protected through federal ownership, and Skamania County will receive land for new development projects outside the scenic area. These proposals still need the support of the House, and their fate will be determined in a joint conference committee this fall. But this action by Senator Gorton, with the support of Senators Gordon Smith, Ron Wyden, and Patty Murray, and Representatives Earl Blumenauer, Darlene Hooley, and Elizabeth Furs, are a very good sign that this part of the Gorge Act is being upheld. So please take the time to contact these leaders and thank them. As I said, this is significant, and it's a sign that all hope is not yet lost. The Gorge Act has broad support. It can work to protect landscapes and landowners, and its potential is enormous. The potential for all the areas that the Gorge Act seeks to encourage is enormous. But this good work at the federal level will not be enough if regional land use planning and protection fails. The Gorge Commission and its staff are supposed to make the Gorge Act work at a local level. Without a strong, protective, informed, and politically savvy Gorge Commission, the Gorge Act will fail. It will fail, I believe. And we as a community will have failed to live up to our responsibility to pass on to our children a great part of the Northwest's natural and cultural heritage. So what can we do to make sure we pass this great heritage on to our children? First, we need to make the gorge a priority. The gorge is a national treasure. Senator Gorton has stepped up to make the gorge a priority for Congress. It is time for the states, the tribes, political leaders, business leaders, community leaders, and environmental leaders to make the gorge a priority again. One first step could possibly be a governor's task force, bringing interest groups and experts together in a public process to assess how the act is working and what can be done to help make it work better. If our Northwest leaders do not make the gorge a priority, however, I am pessimistic about its long-term future. Second, support the act. There's a lot of talk from some politicians about the act doesn't work, the act. The act is a broad framework that supports protection and smart growth. It's implemented at the local level, and that's where it needs to be fixed. And I have to say, the balance in the act was achieved after more than 50 years of efforts by both states and much compromise by all sides. And the gorge's spectacular resources cannot afford more compromise. Third, support the Gorge Commission, but hold it accountable. The Commission is important because it is the only agency that exists to support the gorge. Counties, cities, and others, even if well-meaning, have many other issues on their plate. So without a strong, well-funded Gorge Commission, the gorge will not be protected. What does the Commission need? Well, at least they need strong commissioners who support the act and want to make it work. Governor Gary Locke will be making an upcoming appointment, and this appointment will be critical to the future of the gorge. The Commission needs scrutiny. In recent years, the Commission's been invisible. I appreciate this forum, and I think we need to talk to more people. The next meeting is August 12 in Hood River, and I'll take bets there might be an interesting discussion if anybody wants to show up. The Commission needs support. Many of the Commission members and staff are trying to do a good job. They're not getting much help or support. Fourth, plan for future generations. Change is happening quickly. There is no understanding of how this change is affecting the gorge and what it will mean. If you take off down the road and you don't know where you're going, you may or may not like it when you get there. You may not even know when you get there. The Commission doesn't know where it's going, and it won't know when or if it gets there. And in this situation, making policy decisions or revisions to gorge protection laws is extremely unwise. Without comprehensive information and evaluation, the Commission should not undertake substantive revisions in its land use laws, yet it is under tremendous political pressure to do so. So we need to get some better planning going for the gorge. Finally, we need to expand investment in the gorge's quality of life. The $8 million appropriated by Senator Gorton will help protect thousands of acres of critical lands, but it is not enough to protect all of the crown jewels of the gorge or provide remedies to all landowners. One thing that is desperately needed in the gorge, which is not there today, is a land trust that is focused solely on conservation of gorge lands, which can provide more options to landowners and alternatives for protecting lands and resources. With the tremendous growth pressures that we have, I don't think we can expect the federal, state, or local governments to do it all, and so a land trust is something that really needs to get going. Secondly, what about the urban areas, many of which are languishing? These thousands of acres of urban area land are exempt from Gorge Act regulation and available for development. In Skamania County alone, there are 6,000 urban acres vacant and ready for development. Public and private partnerships are needed to find ways this land can be developed to provide family wage jobs and capitalize on the spectacular location and resources of the area. Well, these are just a few ideas. There are undoubtedly many more, and I'd love to hear all of them. If I've done anything today, I hope I've dispelled the perception that the gorge has been taken care of. The gorge is not safe for future generations. It needs help from all of the leaders in the Northwest who understand the importance of investing in the future of our communities and our environment and passing on to our children this magical place as we have found it. And in closing, I'd like to leave you with a quote from a 1992 advertisement by the Skamania County Chamber of Commerce about the gorge. I love this quote. "No fast food franchises, no theme parks, no shopping malls, no traffic jams. Less than an hour east of Portland, you will find open spaces, spectacular views, and experiences you won't find anywhere else." Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Let's do what needs to be done to make sure we can keep it that way. Thank you.
That was very powerful, and I am really, really impressed. Thank you both. As chair of the program committee for the City Club, I am the contact person for complaints, and I received one last week. Senator Ted Ferrioli, a state senator of District 28, which covers the Oregon stretch from east of Gresham, the length of the gorge, called me to protest that the City Club, by inviting Steve and Laurie, would only represent one side of such a politically a controversial issue. So I will relinquish my question to Senator Ted Ferrioli, and I feel in a sense it's been answered, and it's probably more of a statement, but I think we could hear a little bit more on this topic. When the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area was created nearly a decade ago, half of its mission was to help develop and diversify the economy of the gorge communities. 10 years later, both sides of the river experienced lower per capita income, higher unemployment, and received less per capita federal funding compared to the rest of Oregon or Washington or the nation. In addition, cost to those residents for planning and development services, police protection, health and safety services has skyrocketed without the anticipated tourist financial benefit. According to Senator Ferrioli, the scenic area designation has been a financial and economic disaster. Would you please comment?
Well, I think, ironically, I think Senator Ferrioli and I agree about some of this. He's as disappointed by the lack of success of some portions of the economic development program as I am. And he and I were on different sides of this funding issue in the legislature, to be sure, but the discussions we had were fairly good ones. And it's intensely frustrating because I suspect if we'd gone about our job properly, Senator Ferrioli and the commission would be working on some projects together.
I have a brief comment, which is you may in the future see and you may have seen already, there was an Oregonian opinion editorial by Senator Ferrioli with a little box by the executive director of the Mid-Columbia Economic Development District with this gloom and doom scenario of the economic situation in the gorge. And what you will see, and look carefully at the numbers that they use when they claim that it's all gloom and doom, what they'll do is compare the gorge, which is a very rural area, thank God still, with the Portland Metro and Seattle Puget Sound economies. And certainly in the history of the rural areas in this nation, I think the rural areas have always lagged behind the economic prosperity of the larger metropolitan centers. So what we see in the gorge is that gorges traditionally always in the years past lagged behind the larger regional centers. That's still true today. However, if you look at the unemployment, per capita income, and job statistics from 10 years ago in the gorge and compare it to today, things have improved. They've gotten better. That doesn't mean we should stop working on it. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues that should be resolved. However, I was disappointed that the way it was supposedly going to be resolved was by killing the Gorge Commission instead of focusing on things that people can work together on to improve the situation. So I would say that people who are concerned about economics need to figure out what we can do to fix the situation, and slashing agency budgets and rolling back the Gorge Act won't solve that problem. So.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Ms. Aunan, as you pointed out, protection of the gorge on the federal level has been the product of bipartisan consensus. In the vote, however, this year in the Oregon legislature to slash the commission budget, it was largely on partisan lines. 8 of the 10 Democrats voted against the budget as inadequate. 16 of the 20 Republican senators voted for the reduced budget, including, interestingly, Senator Tom Hartung from west of Portland, who calls himself a Tom McCall environmentalist. I'm curious as to why you think gorge protection has become a partisan issue in the Oregon legislature, and incidentally, whether you think it's possible to try Tom Hartung for environmental treason.
I don't know about the second half, but the first half is, you're very, very right. If you looked at the Gorge Act and who supported it, it was extremely bipartisan. You can go down the list of Republican senators, Senator Dan Evans from Washington, Senator Hatfield, of course, Senator Packwood. I'm sure there's others I can't remember now, but in fact, largely it was a Republican effort in the 1980s to make sure the gorge was protected and the economy supported. I think this attack on the budget was calculated because certainly attacking a bureaucratic agency's budget doesn't look bad until you realize what it really means. I think it's part of a larger issue that we've seen a bigger shift in politics, a bigger split in moderate versus extreme politics, and that's about as much as I can say.
I'm Don Sterling, a member. You've both been forthright in describing what you see as the shortcomings of the commission, but you've been very tactful about saying why that commission is so ineffective. Does one of you want to say anything further about why you haven't been able to accomplish anything?
It's very hard to find the bad guy. The commissioners work very hard. They're a good bunch of people. They try to get along with each other. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next couple of weeks. The Forest Service is not the bad guy. I think Art Carroll is a capable man, and Jurgen Hess, who's the director of planning at the Forest Service part of the gorge, is a very capable guy. I don't have sometime after the commission, ably led by Staff Hansel and consisting of some spectacular appointees, staffed by a staff directed by Dick Benner, adopted the management plan in late 91 and early 92. Sometime after that, we seemed to lose our focus a little bit. The mission was clear up to that point. We had to design and put in place a management plan, and they did a wonderful job. It was a terribly demanding process, and I think it's a good plan. But I can't get to the bottom of it, and one of the other reasons why it took me 3 years to reach the conclusions that I just laid out to you is that it's hard to find the answer to your question.
I have a brief comment, which is that I think the biggest problem is that people assumed that the gorge was protected, and the people who care about it weren't involved anymore. And when you have something that is look at this as the Oregon land use planning system for a region, and think of it in Washington State, some of the counties there didn't even have zoning when this act came in. It's a very big culture change, and it's going to take some getting used to. But the commission office is located in White Salmon, Washington. They've become very isolated. They don't talk to a lot of folks. They don't hear from people who are supportive. And so all the pressure has been coming from one side. All the pressure has been coming from, we don't like this. weaken it. So I think that over time takes its toll. And if we want to turn this thing around, we have to get more people involved, people who are concerned about long-term planning, people who understand the effects on resources. The states need to get more involved and show that it is important to the states that this thing works. But across the board, it's been pretty one-sided is how in the last, I'd say, 5 years.
I'm Bill Crane from Saturday Academy and a City Club member. My question is about the rising generation. If we're not going to, in say 20 years, be sitting listening to yet another City Club speech or everything else that you've talked about in the problems of the gorge, we need to be training young people today to have appropriate thinking in what sounds to me like an incredibly complex problem. Also, we live in a state in which we have mandated that all students in high school are to have school-to-work experiences, school-to-work transition experiences. What's going on or what should go on for young residents of the Gorge and the Portland area to make them learn hands-on, non-classroom, real life, what would be appropriate for stewarding the Gorge?
That's a wonderful question. There are all kinds of opportunities. Janice Staver, my fellow commissioner who's here, has been very interested in trying to get some kind of Gorge Institute started. This would be perhaps associated with a community college, which would teach as academics perhaps, but also with work experience and on-the-ground experience, stewardship, landscaping, tourist management, curatorial programs for the historic aspects of the gorge. We don't have a dime in the budget. I think that money, the money to do that is out there. We could get it. We haven't even, it's not even on the list of the top 100 things we're not going to do this year. It's monumentally frustrating because it's there. Here's another good example. The average age of windsurfers. Those people have an interest in the protection of the gorge. It's probably not terribly articulated, but it's there. We could be doing something with the groups that have a stake in windsurfing. And of course, the commercial payoff is potentially spectacular. I watch those big rigs come into town from Canada or Seattle or California or all over the United States with $40,000, $50,000 worth of investment in a vehicle and 6 boards piled up and all the sails and all the masts and all that represents. And those people come in here, they use one of the finest recreational resources in the world. They buy a cup of coffee, they leave the coffee cup in the waste receptacle, and they use the public restroom, and they go home. We haven't even begun to lighten their pockets to the extent that we can.
I'm Don Frisbee, a member. I'm also a member, Laurie, of your organization. I wonder if you might tell us why we should support the Friends of the Gorge and what that organization is doing specifically in this fight for survival.
Well, actually, that's not a setup question. I didn't ask him to ask that, but thank you. Friends of the Columbia Gorge is the only organization, the only nonprofit organization with its sole mission to make sure that the gorge is protected for future generations. And so that's a huge task. I mean, you've heard Steve mention all the things that the Gorge Commission is trying to do and can't do. What Friends does is try to figure out what of those things we can help influence, and we've made priorities out of continuing to secure federal funding for public land acquisition, because purchasing those lands from willing sellers is the only long-term protection some of those lands will ever really have. We monitor development decisions to make sure that development is not being approved that's illegal. That's how we stopped an urban subdivision that should never have been proposed in the first place. We do stewardship in hiking for people. We've had park and trail cleanup projects the last 2 years, and we take people out on guided tours to see some of the places in the gorge you'd never see. The list goes on. We are funded by memberships, and we would appreciate your memberships. There are some brochures, and if you have any questions at any time ever about the gorge, please call our office.
I'm Ray Polani, a member. Too many people are obviously a problem, but they're also an opportunity. But too many automobiles are too many problems. How about alternatives, buses and trains? And The rest of the world seems to have them. Why not here?
Ray, I'll take a brief stab at that. In some of the planning that's being done by the Forest Service and the State Highway Department, there is talk, perhaps with relation to Sandy River Delta. There's some talk about the problems with the parking lot at Multnomah Falls, trying to figure out how to get people in and out of the gorge for certain purposes other than by the individual private car. There's some real possibilities here. Denali Park in Alaska, for example, when you go to Denali, you get on a school bus, and they use the Fairbanks public school buses in the summer. Everybody wins. The buses are put to good use, the drivers get a summer job, and the tourists ride around. The buses run all day, they're free, you hop on, you hop off, and you'll be driving along the road in Denali, and there'll be a couple of people with a backpack. You'll pick them up and go on, they'll get off wherever they want. There's all kinds of things that could be done. Again, this is somewhere on the list of 200 things that we're not going to get done this year. I think there's money out there for that also.
Well, I want to thank both Laurie from Friends of the Columbia Gorge and Steve McCarthy from the Columbia Gorge Commission for their candid and articulate remarks today, and certainly appreciate their bringing some of these issues to our attention and letting us know what we can do to comment on this issue if we will. So thank you for your attention, and thank you to our speakers. We are adjourned.